sir. We'll move on to papers, sir. Move on to papers, and the papers, it is 8 plus 2 minutes. 8 minutes for the presentation and 2 minutes for the discussion. So the judges will be Dr. Harindranath, Professor of Surgery from Bangalore Medical College, and Dr. L. Arun Kumar from St. Martha's.
Good evening, Dr. Arun and other.
Harindranath, sir.
Harindranath.
Yes, good evening, Dr. Subramani.
Yeah.
And good evening, Dr. Harish.
Sir, good evening, sir. Good evening, sir. Welcome.
Dr. Arun here.
Yes, sir. Harindranath, sir. I think, sir, Harish, you are there.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening, sir. Good evening,
Good
sir.
evening,
Yeah,
Harindranath.
Harish. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We'll start then. Both of them are there. First paper will be by Dr. Joe Thomas. He is postgraduate in general surgery. Predictors of difficulty in laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Dr. Alfin, you can start.
Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Joe Thomas from General Surgery Unit 1, St. John's Medical College, presenting the paper Predictors of Difficult Laparoscopic Cholecystectomy. Laparoscopic cholecystectomy is one of the most commonly performed elective laparoscopic procedures today, first performed by Dr. Eric Muhe from Germany in 1985. There were approximately 750,000 such procedures done in the USA alone in 2018. However, the procedure continues to have a steep learning curve and can result in significant morbidity. Our aim with the study was to identify factors predicting the difficulty of laparoscopic cholecystectomy for a given patient from the history, physical examination, and the preoperative biochemical and radiological evaluation. The need for the study. We performed the study in order to anticipate complications before they occur and to potentially reduce morbidity, and also to improve outcomes for training surgeons by providing supervision where it was required. This statistical analysis of the study involved the comparison of clinical, biochemical, and radiological variables across two groups: difficult and non-difficult laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Categorical or discrete variables were summarized with counts and percentages. Quantitative variables were summarized with mean or standard deviation, or median and interquartile range. A p-value of less than 0.005 was assumed to be significant. The two-sample t-test was used to compare the means between the two groups, and the chi-square test was used to compare the proportions between the groups. Inclusion criteria: patients aged 18 to 80 undergoing elective laparoscopic cholecystectomy within the study period were considered for analysis. They were excluded if they had had other procedures undergone at the same sitting, if there were intraoperative complications not related to the actual performance of the surgical procedure itself, if the patient was pregnant at the time of performance, and emergency laparoscopic cholecystectomies. Materials and methods: the study was a prospective cross-sectional study with a study period from October 2019 to July of 2021. 138 patients undergoing laparoscopic cholecystectomy were analyzed. Ethics committee clearance was taken and individual consent sought from all of the participants. These were the parameters analyzed for all the study participants, split across history, physical examination, biochemical, and radiological parameters. Pre-existing hepatobiliary pathology under history was included but was not limited to patients with choledocholitis, previous biliary pancreatitis, presence of bilioenteric fistulae, or previous biliary tract instrumentation such as ERCP or stenting. For the purpose of the study, number of attacks of cholecystitis was defined as radiologically proven cholecystitis requiring admission in hospital. Obesity was defined as BMI of greater than 30. Preoperative CRP was CRP done at any point during the hospital stay prior to the surgery itself. Endpoints. For the purpose of the study, a difficult laparoscopic cholecystectomy was defined as a procedure requiring an operating time of more than 90 minutes as taken from OP documentation. a procedure that involved conversion to open procedure, a procedure that involved the iatrogenic injury, and subjective surgeon rating was also taken at the end of each procedure. This was defined as a difficulty that was reported by the operating surgeon. Results: 138 patients were assessed by the study, of which 61 were male. 53 laparoscopic cholecystectomies out of 138 were difficult. This was a total of 38.4%. The average operating time was 82 minutes, with a range from 48 minutes to 173 minutes. There were no instances of iatrogenic injury in the study population, with one instance of conversion to open procedure. The results of univariate regression analysis were as follows. Significant predictors were age, with a p-value of less than 0.001, obesity with a p-value of less than 0.001, previous abdominal surgery, either open or laparoscopic, with a p-value of less than 0.001, the presence of previous attacks of acute cholecystitis, again with a p-value of less than 0.001, and preoperative CRP. The factors on the right, that is gender, liver function tests, total count, gallbladder wall thickness, and pericholecystic fluid, were not found to be predictive of difficulty of laparoscopic cholecystectomy. The results of multivariate regression largely mirrored the results of the first, showed obesity, the number of attacks of previous acute calculous cholecystitis, and ALT on preoperative analysis were found to be predictive of difficulty during performance of the procedure. Patients with one previous episode of acute cholecystitis were found to have a 4.46 higher probability of encountering difficulty during procedure. Patients with 2 or more episodes of acute cholecystitis prior to surgery were 37.9 times more likely to have difficulty during the procedure itself. Age, as per our study, age, obesity, previous surgery, previous attacks of cholecystitis, and CRP are predictive of difficulty encountered during laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Consideration of these factors may allow the operating surgeon to anticipate complications, proceed accordingly, and minimize morbidity for the given patient. These were the references consulted. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Alvin. Paper open for discussion. Dr. Harindranath.
Dr. Joe?
Yes, sir.
When you talked about abdominal surgeries, what kind of abdominal surgeries were they?
Sir, both open
and given a breakup of that. What were the surgeries?
Sir, both open and laparoscopic procedures, sir.
Okay.
There were procedures that had laparotomies performed on them. But the most common procedures we came across in the study population was hysterectomies and cesarean sections.
No, because the thing is, if it is an inguinal hernia or something else, probably lower abdomen, probably it really doesn't matter. Mainly, mostly important is probably perforation peritonitis due to duodenal ulcer. Those are the things which probably are of more significance. That is one thing.
Yes.
Oh, and the next thing is, when you're talking, why you didn't want to consider the wall thickness of the gallbladder?
So we consider the wall thickness of the gallbladder. However, it is not found to be significant, sir.
Okay. And what about the stone size? Don't you think a large stone impacted at the neck would make your laparoscopic cholecystectomy difficult, because it is very difficult to grasp at the fundus?
So we did consider adding this criteria, sir, during analysis. However, we found that inter-observer variation in measuring the size of the stone was very high, sir. So we found that it was not objective.
No. With the ultrasound, you will be able to get a rough idea of what, especially we are talking about large stones. We are not talking about small stones. Only a single large stone impacted at the neck, that they should be able to give a fairly good measurement preoperatively. That's one of the probably the criteria also, because many times we get to see that large stones impacted at the neck make the laparoscopic cholecystectomy very difficult. Other comments?
Yeah, Arun, this is Dr. Rosario. I'd agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Because the stones, especially the stones that are stuck in the fundus or at the Hartmann's, it's very difficult to get a grasp on them. So it makes that more difficult to,
True.
and takes that much longer time to proceed with the surgery.
Correct.
That's a good point to consider. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Joe.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Sridhar here.
Yes, sir.
Among the criteria which are chosen with respect to the surgeon mentioning it's a difficult laparoscopically, do you think it's too subjective because a lot of factors go into assessing who does the surgery? Say, for example, a senior person does it, would make it a bit more easy compared to a learner. So, did you take those factors into consideration with respect to who does the surgery?
No, sir. Those factors were not taken into consideration, and so we are aware of the pitfalls of using that criteria.
No, because you have said the surgeon would also determine on a subjective basis how difficult it was, right? Because that makes a lot of difference in who does it.
Any other questions from the audience? If there's no more questions, we'll move on to the second.
Subramaniam, one question.
Yeah.
Dr. Joe, how do you think obesity was a factor as far as difficulty in laparoscopic cholecystectomy is concerned? You said it's one of the independent predictors. Why do you think obesity was for what reason? You know, I can understand that it being a difficulty as far as anesthesia is concerned or whatever, and morbidity may be higher because of the obesity. But as far as surgery is concerned, why do you think it is difficult?
So possibly higher amounts of mesenteric fat.
Mesenteric fat doesn't come into play here at all. I think I don't know whether anybody else in the audience agree with the fact that I think actually, you know, people who have actually done many open cholecystectomies in the pre-laparoscopic era and then now doing laparoscopic cholecystectomies, I think even in obese people, I find it much more easier to do a lap cholecystectomy than open.
And if I may note one more point, sir, there was one more point that we had noted. Obese people are also more possibly likely to have greater inflammation, sir. If they have had previous attacks, are more likely to have cholecystitis and the resulting inflammation resulting in difficult dissections. That might have been a factor predicting, and that too because already both obesity and cholecystectomy, previous cholecystitis are found to be indicative of difficulty. Maybe a worse inflammatory state in the obese population was probably causative of difficulties. Possibly.
Vishankar.
Dr. Ravi.
Yes, Prakash.
Come here.
Yeah.
So this is basically because the liver is huge. Retraction of the liver and approaching the gallbladder and getting into the callous triangle is much more difficult in very obese patients.
Yeah, this is the answer I wanted. This is the answer I wanted from the candidate. You are right. So that is why I think whenever you do obesity and bariatric surgery, you starve the patients or put them on ultra low fat diet for a period of 2 to 4 weeks to reduce the size of the liver.
True. Yeah.
Thank you, Ravi Shankar.
Thank you.
We'll move on to the second paper. Dr. Ramkishore will be presenting post-diabetic surgery. Topic is diagnosis and therapeutic role of laparoscopy in chronic abdominal pain. Dr. Ramkishore, you can present.
Yes, sir. Good evening. My topic is on diagnostics and laparoscopy.
And you will perforate and everything will go in peritoneal cavity. ಅವ್ರ ಮೇಲೆ ಹತ್ಬೇಕಲ್ಲ, ಇಲ್ಲಾದ್ರೆ ಸಾಕಲ್ಲ.
Introduction.
Kindly mute everybody.
So introduction, chronic pain abdomen is defined as pain abdomen for more than 3 months. It's a challenge for diagnosis and accurate management of the same. And usually leads to physical and psychological disability and is associated with poorer quality of life. Patients are often undergo multiple investigations and lead to accumulating cause and dissatisfaction without coming to etiological diagnosis. And in most of for more than 40% of the chronic pain abdomen, it remains idiopathic. Hence, diagnostic lab is an effective tool to be used in diagnosis.
The audio is not clear.
Hear me now, sir.
A lot of disturbance in the audio.
Disturbance, Ram Kishore, problem with the connection?
Oh, sir, I can.
I think other than the presenter, all others should mute, I feel. Can we move?
People must understand live recording is going on. Why don't they mute their audio?
I continue.
One second. Harish, mute everybody, Harish, except the speaker.
Harish, is it possible to mute everyone other than the presenter?
Just mute everybody and the presenter can unmute himself. I think that is the best.
Even Dr. Subramaniam can mute.
Dr. Subramaniam, mute everybody and only presenter unmute himself and starts talking.
Mute everyone. Where can you help me out?
Host will have an option. You must go to meeting setting. I think you can stop the recording for a while, please. Who is controlling Society laptop? Who is controlling Surgical Society laptop?
Ram Kishore.
Yes, sir.
Just whether
I can't hear you, sir.
Whether you can mute from there, where?
I can only mute myself, sir.
No, the St. John's Medical College is also a co-host.
Okay.
They will be able to mute others.
Where Dr. Venkat?
You must go, I think, to mute meeting settings, meeting on the toolbar.
Meeting information.
Meeting on the toolbar. Who is controlling Surgical Society of laptop? Please stop the recording for a while.
Ram Kishore, it's being controlled there only. It's being recorded there only.
Yes, sir.
Stop recording, it seems.
This recording is happening by 2 places, I think. The host and co-host will be able to mute others.
Mute all, I'll click. Okay.
Because there I can see that many people are still not muted. In the list, what I could see. Nobody is muted, I think. Everybody is unmuted now.
So mute all present and new participants.
Now it is okay. Dr. Prakash, please mute yourself, sir.
Yeah.
Manu, ಮತ್ತೆ ಇದಾಯ್ತು. ಮನು ಯಾರು ಮನು? Again, it is unmuted.
Next height Tata gari onde height attikule papa makla that so
Mute all. Okay, Ramkishore, try now. Unmute yourselves and present.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me now, sir?
Yes.
Okay, sir. I'll start back the video, sir.
I think everyone is muted now. Yeah, start.
Okay, sir. So as I was saying, I'll start from the beginning, sir. So chronic pain abdomen is defined as pain abdomen for more than 3 months. It's a challenge for diagnosis and accurate treatment of the same, and usually leads to poor quality of life and with physical and psychological disability. It is seen that in 40% of patients with chronic pain abdomen, it's idiopathic, and regardless of extensive investigations, usually there is no diagnosis and accumulates in excessive cost and dissatisfaction. Hence, diagnostic lab should be considered in such patients. Laparoscopy is a safe, simple, and accurate tool which gives us a direct visualization of the peritoneal cavity with easy tissue access for tissue biopsy. It can identify abnormal findings missed on radiology. There's a rapid recovery and low morbidity associated with the procedure, and it can be therapeutic as well as diagnostic in the same setting. And it has shown to improve the outcome in majority of patients with chronic pain abdomen, and it's a good alternative to diagnostic laparotomy. The aims and objectives of this study is to define the role of diagnostic lab in therapeutic and diagnostic role of chronic pain abdomen. Coming to materials and methods, inclusion criteria is adults with idiopathic chronic pain abdomen for more than 3 months. Exclusion criteria is patients who are unfit and patients who were pregnant at the time of study. Study type, this study is a prospective study conducted in St. John's after the clearance of institutional ethics. Here, written consent was taken prior to involvement of participants in the study. It was conducted from July 2019 to July 2021. Sample size of the study was 42, and it was arrived assuming that 43% of the subjects have the factor of interest, and with an absolute precision of 15% and 95% confidence interval. Statistical calculations were made, analyzed using SPSS software. Here, a p-value of less than 0.01 was considered statistically significant, and descriptive statistics were used. Mean and standard deviation was used for continuous variables, number and percentage for categorical variables, and chi-square test will be used wherever association is to be tested between categorical variables, and the independent t-test will be used to compare means of two groups as appropriate. Data collection, preoperatively, general examination and the history of the patient was taken, and the pain scaling preoperatively was done using numerical pain intensity scale. Briefly on the scale, it is a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being no pain and 10 being the worst pain in the life of the patient. Routine preoperative investigations were done, and operative data, intraoperative findings along with the therapeutic intervention done was noted. Postoperatively, pain scaling was done after 30 days in OPD follow-up, and histopathological report was followed up. Coming to surgical techniques, all the surgeries in the study were performed under general anesthesia with 10 mm umbilical port inserted using the Hassen's method. Additional ports were inserted based on the findings, and thorough diagnostic laparoscopy was done, initially in the supracoelic compartment, then the infracoelic compartment, then in the pelvis. Coming to the results of the study, it results according to demographic distribution of chronic pain abdomen with etiological and intervention and pain relief at 1 month. Coming to results, total number of patients in the study were 42. It is seen that mean age of symptomatic patients were 39.5, and there's a male predominance of 60%. As per this table, the most common laparoscopic finding was peritoneal tubercles, seen in 42.52% of the patients, and most common diagnosis in the study was abdominal tuberculosis, seen in 33% of the patients. Next most common laparoscopic finding was involving appendicular pathology, mainly subacute appendicitis, seen in 11.9% of patients. This is a graphical representation of the same. This is the intra photo showing peritoneal tubercles, classical of abdominal tuberculosis. It's an intraoperative photo of adhesions, and subacute appendices is one of the cases in the study. This is one case in the study had endometritis. This is the photo showing powder burn marks on the peritoneum. This is another case in the study showing the paracecal hernia with the probe in the cavity of the ankle hernia. This is a table showing the preoperative and postoperative pain assessment versus the diagnosis of the patient. Next. This is a graphical representation of the same. Coming to preoperative, postoperative, and pain reduction, it is seen that the mean P50 in preoperative pain index was 6, and postoperative was 1, and the reduction in pain, mean of reduction in pain was 5, and p-value is 0.05 and statistically significant. There's a significant reduction between pre-op and post-op pain, post-diagnostic lab pain intervention. Preoperative pain versus age, it is seen that it is not statistically significant in the study. Preoperative pain by diagnosis was shown not to be statistically significant in this particular study. Reduction in pain by diagnosis also was shown not to be statistically significant in this study. Reduction in pain by age was shown to be statistically significant, with age less than 40 years having higher pain reduction with a mean of 6, whereas age more than 40 had a pain reduction of around mean of around 4. So 85.07% of patients in the study gave history of positive response, with 14.2% of patients having persistent pain at the time of follow-up, that is after 1 month. So coming to the procedures performed in study, the most common procedure performed in study was biopsy, done in 44.9% of the patients, followed by next most common is appendicectomy, done in 16.6% of the patients. It's a graphical representation of the same. Majority of procedure done was biopsy, followed by appendicectomy. Coming to discussion, laparoscopy is considered controversial, not evidence-based, and not recommended as a first line of treatment in patients with the chronic pain abdomen that have whose etiology has not been shown. Laparoscopy has its limitations. The main being that there is no visualization of the luminous structure of hollow organs. It does not allow the surgeon to palpate the organs, and lesions in the depth of solid organs could not be assessed, for which intra-op ultrasound will be needed, but this was not part of the study. Laparoscopy is not widely available, and it needs costly equipment. Compared to other studies, in a study done by Anders, it was shown that postoperative pain outcome was 95.6%. In our study, positive pain outcome was around 85.007%. Relief of pain was 74%, and in ours it was relief of pain was 30.9%. Another study by Moussa, pain relief was 53.3%. In our study, it was 30.9%. Pain reduction was 26.7%. In our study, it was 54.7%, and persistent pain was seen in 19.8% of the study. In ours, it was 14.2%. Another study by Raji, mean age of presentation was seen to be 31.7 years. In our study, mean age of presentation was 39.5. Most common diagnosis in that study was appendicular pathology, seen in 56% of the patients. In ours, it was abdominal TB, seen in 33% of the patients. In a study by Zafar, it was seen that definitive diagnosis could be achieved in 89.1% of the patient. In our study, definitive diagnosis was achieved in 92.86% of the patients. Positive pain relief was 92% in the Zafar study by Zafar. In our study, positive pain outcome was 85.07%. In our study, definitive diagnosis was achieved in 92.86% of the patients, with initiation of operative intervention in the same 92.86% of patients. Most common intraoperative finding was peritoneal tuberculosis, seen in 42.52% of population, and there was a negative normal intra findings or negative laparoscopy on in 7.14% of patients. The total positive pain outcome in this study was 85.07%. Conclusion, diagnostic lab is a very effective tool in diagnosis. It has a high therapeutic value, and hence diagnostic lab should be considered early when limits of non-invasive testings are reached in management of idiopathic chronic pain abdomen. These are the references I have.
Thank you, Ram Kishore.
Thank you,
Paper
sir.
open for discussion.
Dr. Ram Kishore.
Yes, sir.
When you did the investigations, preoperative investigations, what was the investigation after which you said, now I think we should subject this patient to diagnostic laparoscopy?
Most of the patients, radiologically, most of the patients presented with ultrasound, sir. Ultrasound abdomen. And in few cases, even CT was done.
In only few cases is CT?
When repeat ultrasound was not showing anything, we were not going for CT in all patients. Sometimes if the patient had any contraindications, you do only a plain CT and not follow up with a CT.
I feel probably, I mean, this was all in your institution, the cases, right?
Yes, sir.
And you have a CT scan?
Yes, sir.
And when that is the case and a patient has a chronic pain abdomen for more than 3 months before subjecting to diagnostic laparoscopy, wouldn't it be prudent to do a CT scan with contrast before you go ahead? Because these kind of abdominal tuberculosis, what you said, probably could have been picked up by the CT, the strictures and other things. You could have avoided an intervention, or maybe you would have to go in later and even for a biopsy, that's a different thing. But why a CT was not done? And as I said, only in few cases, I would probably expect something opposite. Most of the cases CT was done, in a few cases it was not done before subjecting, because as you know, diagnostic laparoscopy also is an invasive procedure.
Yes, sir.
And your previous presenter, you said that will add to the difficult laparoscopic cholecystectomies, one of the reasons. So when such is the case, probably CT was mandatory, at least in most of these cases. And second thing is, did you rule out any functional causes before subjecting the patient to diagnostic laparoscopy? Was there any psychiatric assessment done in any of these patients?
So no, psychiatric assessment was not done routinely in all patients.
Yeah, because you said 14% the pain was persistent after the procedure. That is a significant number. So probably they could be functional. And the next thing is, you said post-operatively when you assess the pain, at what intervals did you assess the pain? And when was your last pain assessment?
Post-operatively assessed only once, 1 month after time of discharge.
I didn't get you. At time of discharge?
1 month after discharge.
1 month after discharge. Not after that?
No, sir.
When you are saying chronic pain abdomen, which has been there for more than 3 months, probably a little more longer follow-up for pain assessment is required. Okay. That's all from my side. And what did you do for the patients who had persistent pain? What did you do with those patients?
Those patients, we try to get a psychological evaluation for them.
Yeah, that's the point. So probably sometimes you will be able to kind of make out that there is a kind of functional overlay in such patients, few patients. So them probably subjecting to a psychiatric assessment earlier on probably can avoid this diagnostic laparoscopy also.
Dr. Arun,
yes.
Dr. Sridhar here. Yeah. Regarding your first comment with respect to CT, I think I would agree with you. CT should have been a bit more often done before subjecting them to diagnostic laparoscopy.
True.
I think many times these references come from a few departments where a tissue diagnosis is very important for us. So that is why our numbers have been more with TB.
I also said that yes, we would need tissue diagnosis, but we would know preoperatively what the diagnosis is. And because he said in few cases we did a CT.
I would agree with you.
And so the other way around, then probably you would have still said that's fine.
I would agree with you.
Any other questions? Ramkisha, there are a few questions in the chat box from Dr. Srivastava. When was the post-op pain?
That I've already asked. That was already done.
Okay.
Time is up. We'll move on to next papers.
We'll move on
Thank you,
to
sir.
the third paper. Dr. Joanna, PG in Surgery 3 will be presenting. Comparison of vacuum-assisted closure versus saline dressing in management of diabetic ulcer. Its outcome in terms of rate of wound healing, bacterial growth, outcome on glycemic control. Dr. Joanna, you can present.
Good evening, respected President Dr. Venkatachala, Honorable Secretary Dr. Harisha, and respected HOD of St. John's Medical College Hospital. And good evening to one and all. My topic of paper is vacuum-assisted closure versus conventional dressing in the management of diabetic ulcers. I'm presenting for Unit 3. As we know, India is ranked in the nation's first among the nations affected with diabetes. And foot ulceration is the most common complication that we see in India, affecting almost 15% of the diabetic patients. It's attributed to several social and cultural practices like barefoot walking, inadequate knowledge of the disease or awareness of the complications, or inadequate facilities for diabetic care, poor socio-economic status. And also it's followed by amputation. It contributes not only to the mobility but also reduced quality of life. The length of the wound healing in diabetics is mainly affected because of ischemia and intrinsic defects in angiogenesis, impaired immunity against infection, and chronic diabetic neuropathy and vasculopathy. They would have a longer hospital stay of more than 60%. These wounds are difficult to heal. There are different methods of dressing that can be used. These are silver dressing, anodyne dressing, extracorporeal shockwave, or regular saline dressings, and the most common vacuum-assisted closure. Vacuum-assisted closure, which uses both negative pressure to heal the wound, assist wound healing. It has two ways of acting. One is macro strain, and the other is a micro strain. Macro strain is where there's negative pressure to contact the foam. It draws the wound edges together and also removes the exudate and infectious material. It reduces the edema and promotes perfusion and angiogenesis. The micro strain mainly acts at the tissue level, which increases the cellular penetration and protein synthesis. The objective of my study was to compare the outcome in terms of wound healing period in vacuum-assisted closure and saline dressings, and also to know the outcome of glycemic control in vacuum-assisted closure and conventional dressing. Methodology used was it was a prospective single-centered study, including all the diabetic more than 18 years of age with ulcer more than 8 centimeters in the greatest dimension. Exclusion criteria: patients having osteomyelitis or arterial or venous insufficiency, and those who did not consent for the study. Patients were randomly assigned to the VAC therapy or conventional dressing after getting a valid consent from them and getting the IAC approval. Wound were assessed before VAC application and 5th day after the VAC removal. Parameters that I assessed were decrease in ulcer size, time taken for complete closure of wound, reduction in exudate, increased granulation tissue, and HbA1c at admission and after 3 months. Patients were followed up to 3 months after discharge. This is the demographic details. Mostly in my study, there were a more number of males. In conventional dressing, there were 13 males, and in vacuum dressing, there were 11 males. Next. This is a comparison of wound area between time points separately, showing that there is a significant difference in the area of wound between the time points between different treatments seen here. The p-value of 0.02. This was one of my patients with VAC dressing, which was assessed at day 1 and day 5, which shows increase in granulation tissue and reduced exudate and filling up of the wound. So comparing my epithelialization and return to normal work, in conventional dressing compared to vacuum dressing, there was a p-value of 0.01, and also in return to routine work, vacuum dressing had a significant return in return to normal activities, which shows a significant difference. Next. This is a slide showing the percentage reduction in wound size. I compared on day 0, day 15, 30, 45, 2 months, and 3 months. There was a significant difference in the average of reduction in size at different point of time between the different treatments. HbA1c at 2 different levels. There is no significant difference that I found in my study, with average of HbA1c values being more than 0.05 p-value. The results of my study: there was a significant reduction in the wound size using VAC therapy with p-value of less than 0.05, and early discharge from hospital. In patients with vacuum therapy, there was a minimum of 3 to 4 days of hospital stay, and then they were discharged. Reduction in hospital costs procured because of the admission and the procedure. and faster epithelialization and return to normal life in patients with vacuum dressing compared to the other group, but there was no significant difference in the average of HbA1c between both the treatments. The limitations of the study was that it was a small sample size. Many patients were lost due to COVID pandemic. There were technical issues in assessing wounds and getting patients for follow-up, and conventional dressings were done by different personnel at different settings. Conclude saying that vacuum dressing helps in wound reduction and faster healing. There's reduction in the number of days of hospital stay with vacuum dressing, and there's faster return to routine activities in patients who underwent vacuum dressing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joanna. Paper open for discussion. Dr. Arun?
Dr. Joanna?
Yes, sir.
You said in your aims that one of the aim was about the glycemic reduction with vacuum dressing.
Yes, sir.
What was your conclusion on that? Because in the conclusion slide, it is not mentioned.
There was no reduction in, there was no change in glycemic controls in between both groups. However, between each group, there was a reduction compared to pre-op, and within 3 months, there was a reduction in the HbA1c, sir.
No, comparatively, was vacuum dressing more helpful in reducing or no?
No, sir. I didn't find any significant difference.
Because if that is your aim, then that has to come into your conclusion also. You should mention we found no significant reduction in the glycemic
yes,
value.
Sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. I mentioned it.
No, in the conclusion slide.
Oh, okay, sir.
Okay. Number one. And yes, vacuum dressing is widely accepted that it is a good process for a wound healing. So that's what I have nothing more to add to this.
Question from me, Dr. Joanna.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned it as saline dressing. What do you mean by saline dressing? You say conventional dressing somewhere and you say saline dressing somewhere else.
So it's a regular betadine and saline usage for the dressing, sir. What we normally
mentioned about betadine or povidone iodine. You just mentioned saline dressing.
Yes, sir.
Doesn't it? That makes a lot of difference. You just use saline dressing and nothing else.
Yes, sir.
That makes a lot of difference between vacuum dressing and saline dressing, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay.
Anything more? Dr. Arun? Dr. Arun?
I think from our side, Dr. Ravi Shankar, I think he has something.
Dr. Ravi Shankar is online.
Yeah. Dr. Joanna,
yes,
did you not consider, see, you put only one VAC application.
Yes, sir.
Did you not consider continuing with that VAC application maybe 2 or 3 times, because you've chosen wounds which are of fairly large size, 8 centimeters or so.
Yes,
so if you had considered, applying the VAC therapy for further 1 or 2 applications, you could have actually accelerated the process even further.
Yes, sir. This patient actually had 5 sittings of VAC, sir. Today I had seen him. It is significantly improved, sir.
But you said only one VAC application.
No, sir. Based on the patient-to-patient variability and affordability, we continued the VAC therapy, sir.
So then what happens is that your study becomes heterogeneous. There should be uniformity. If there is no uniformity, then you can't conclude between the 2 groups. You should either decide it is 1 application or 3 applications or whatever. If you are doing it on a case-per-case basis, that is fine. But you can't then make conclusions based on that, because your protocol will be breached.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, Ravi Shankar. If there's no more questions, we'll move on to the...
Sir, Himagirish here.
Himagirish.
Yeah, just a comment. Yes, Dr. Ravi Shankar, yes, sir, your point is completely, it's completely valid. We take your point that for homogeneity, there has to be homogeneity, when we have to compare between 2 patients, there has to be homogeneity. But yeah, that is one other limitation of this study, in the sense that if the wound required a 2nd or 3rd application of VAC, it was done. And of course, patient affordability and patient factors also come into this. But yeah, I totally agree with your point, saying that if there is homogeneity, it has to be applied across the 2 groups. To answer Dr. Harindranath's point about betadine dressings, we generally apply VAC once we are kind of convinced that the infection is gone from the wound. Once the wound is clean, even though it's a big wound, if there's adequate debridement and if the wound has no clinical signs of infection, it is then that we go in and apply the VAC. And in such wounds, we generally don't use antiseptic agent. In clean wounds, we generally avoid anything other than saline.
Let me intervene. You compared with the saline dressing. That's what the comment was.
Yes, yes.
When you compare with the other dressings, right? So I thought of asking this question.
Yes, sir. That's interesting. So maybe we'll try.
I'm not talking about povidone iodine used in vacuum dressing.
Okay. No, we don't use povidone iodine even in the control arm also, because we use vacuum only when we know that there's, or when we feel that clinically there's no infection. But your point is, we'll take your point, sir. It is interesting. Maybe we can conduct another arm where we use betadine on one arm and vac on the other arm. So many possibilities.
Dr. Himagirish, another point to note is that you don't have to wait for the wound to become very clean before applying vac therapy. You actually, one of the advantages of vac therapy is that it will suck out the exudate also. So you can apply it even on dirty wounds also.
Himagirish, I would strongly second Ravi Shankar's view. Vacuum, one of the roles for vacuum for the benefit of postgraduates is to clear infection faster. That's why the wound heals faster. So the idea is to clear the infection, so you don't wait until the infection is better before you apply vacuum.
Discharge can be there, but slough has to be removed.
Yeah, slough has to be removed.
Yeah, fair enough.
One apprehension is that we are converting a wound into an abscess by sealing it off if there's still significant infection.
No, the idea of the vacuum is to suck it out. There won't be any collection at all. If there is a collection, then your vacuum is not working well.
As Dr. Lakshman and Dr. Ravi Shankar say, it is very true that you just have to remove the slough. But any exudates, definitely vac will help in removing the exudates and helping the wound to heal faster. We have used on many cases where after the debridement with exudates there, still it helps.
Yeah.
Thank you, Himagirish.
Thank you, sir.
We'll move on to the next paper. Dr. Simili Poshayat in surgery will be presenting for Unit 4. The topic is effect of post-operative local change in temperature on post-operative pain and surgical site infections, a prospective study. Dr. Simili, you can present.
Respected President, Dr. Venkatachala, Honorable Secretary, Dr. Harisha, and respected HOD of St. John's Medical College, good evening to one and all. I'm presenting on effect of postoperative local change in temperature in postoperative pain and surgical site infections. Introduction. Pain is an unavoidable side effect of any surgeries. It arises from local inflammation in traumatized tissues and causes stimulation of the surrounding nociceptors. Adequate postoperative analgesia aids in recovery, mobility, satisfaction. Multimodal analgesia reduces postoperative pain and mechanism of action of local cord. It reduces inflammation and swelling by facilitating oxygenation of cells, slows the cell's metabolic rate, and reduces oxygen demand. It also increases patient's pain threshold by decreasing free nerve ending sensitivity, increasing the patient's pain thresholds, and slowing synaptic activity and inhibition of nociceptive receptors. Mechanism of action of local heat. It increases local oxygen delivery by maintaining and modifying oxygen perfusion, promotes macrophages and T cell responses required for normal healing, and also increasing the speed of tissue repair and availability to the local cells. Objective of the study is to study the effect of local change in temperature in postoperative pain and to identify the role of local change in temperature in postoperative surgical site infection. Inclusion criteria. Patients operated electively in the Department of General Surgery, aged between 18 years to 60 years, with the midline laparotomy incision. Exclusion criteria were patients operated on an emergency basis and who underwent re-surgery during the same hospital stay, and patients with comorbidities like diabetes and peripheral vascular disease. The type of the study is a prospective interventional study done in a single center study and tertiary care hospital. Study design. Total number of patients involved in the study were 93, which includes male 53 and female 40. And each treatment groups included cold 30, heat 30, and neutral 33. And all the patients were followed up till 10 days. The demographic characteristics of the patients. Out of 93 patients, 53 were male, 40 were female, and implants like mesh were used in 30 patients and non-implants 63 patients. And the suture technique, out of 93, 10 had staples and 83 were used as sutures. Materials and methods. 93 patients were enrolled in the study between September 2019 to September 2021. Study subjects randomly allotted into warm, cold, and control groups. Subjects were exposed to change in temperature with infrared lamp, that is heat, cold gel ice packs, and control were the neutral temperature of the recovery room. And it was applied at the surgical site for 30 minutes in the immediate postoperative period, post-op day 1, post-op day 2, post-op day 5, and via telephonic interview on post-op day 10. Pain assessment was done using visual analog scale and numerical pain scale. Patients also followed up for surgical site infection in the hospital on post-op day 3 and post-op day 5. And if patient is in the hospital on post-op day 10, or if discharged from the input from the local physician. And the surgical site infection was measured by aseptic wound scoring based on additional therapy with antibiotics and debridement, erythema, purulent discharge, serous discharge, separation of deep tissue, or isolation of bacteria, and hospital stay more than 14 days. These were the treatment methods which I used with the infrared light and also with the ice pack. Materials and methods. Among the treatment groups, the cold group contained 30 patients, out of which 7 were malignancy, 5 were subacute interstitial obstruction, and hernia 10, stoma reversal 3, and others were 5. Heat, malignancies were 7, SCIO were 2, hernia 10, stoma reversal 2, and others were 9. Neutral, malignancy 7, SCIO 7, hernia 10, stoma reversal 4, and others were 7. Statistical analysis were done by using categorical counts and percentages. Quantitative variables were analyzed by using mean and standard deviation or median or interval range. Or non-parametric data was used by Matt-Whitney U-test. And for all the analysis, the significance, 5% level of significance is considered to be significant, that is less than 0.005. Checking the significance of association between surgical site infection and treatments. The total number of patients were 93, out of which 30 were assigned to cold group, out of which 4 had surgical site infections, and heat 30 patients were there, out of which 1 had surgical site infections, and neutral group had 33 patients, out of which 3 had surgical site infections, with the percentage of 50, 12.5, 37.5. And the p-value was 0.428, and found that there is no statistically significant association between surgical site infection and the treatments. Comparison of visual analog score separately for post-operative days 0, 1, 2, 5, and 10 were done based on the type of treatments. And the p-value for post-op day 0 was 1, post-op day 1 was 0.523. Post-op day 2, it was less than 0.001, and post-op day 5, less than 0.001. Post-op day 10, it was 0.323. And the study showed that there was statistically significant reduction was there in pain on post-op day 2 and post-op day 5 to the patients involved with the cold therapy and heat therapy. And visual analog score was between treatments on day 2 and day 5, were compared between the cold and neutral, heat and neutral, and heat and cold by using Mann-Whitney test. And it showed that on post-op day 2, the p-value for cold and neutral were 0.003, and post-op day 5, it was less than 0.001. And the treatment group with the comparison between heat and neutral was 0.001, and for post-op day 5 also it was less than 0.001. Between heat and cold, the p-value was 0.201, and post-op day 5 it was 0.248, which showed that there was significant reduction between the treatments on day 2 and day 5. There was significant reduction in pain. Discussions. Ice pack and infrared light reduced postoperative pain and use of narcotics in the immediate postoperative days. Complementary to other pain management strategies, it is easy to administer, affordable, acceptable, has minimal or no toxicity. There was no significant difference in surgical site infections. Limitations. Limited sample size due to COVID pandemic, and diabetes and other immunocompromised conditions were not included, as wanted to take it as a pilot study. There is statistically significant reduction in postoperative pain on post-op day 2 and post-op day 5 in local change in temperature groups, as p-value is less than 0.05. There is no significant difference in surgical site infections between the groups with the local change in temperature. Conclusion, ice packs and infrared light are simple, non-invasive, and cost-effective adjuvant standard postoperative pain management. In patients undergoing abdominal surgeries, it reduced postoperative pain, narcotic use, hospital stay, and it promotes early mobilization.
Thank you,
Thank
Sister
you.
Simile.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Paper open for discussion.
Dr. Simile,
Yes,
Dr.
sir.
Arunya.
Yes, sir.
A very interesting paper, a very good topic. Probably something which we need to, there is probably a good take-home message too. But what I want to know is, what is the temperature? When you're talking about heat, what was the temperature which was generated?
Sir, the infrared light, the wavelength was beyond 700 nanometers, sir.
Was there any way where you could check the room temperature? Was this patient kept in a separate room?
Sir, only in the immediate post-operative period, patient was kept in the post-op recovery room, where it was the temperature was same.
And this patient had, all these patients had their dressings on. I was seeing the Dynaplast with a thick dressing pad, one pad probably with a thick pad on the Dynaplast. All of them had a dressing on.
Yes, sir.
Would it be a little prudent to have the dressing removed, or probably a single gauze piece to cover the wound and do it for all the patients?
Sir, but when we are using the infrared light, it would be better to have the dressing on.
Why so?
Or else we are keeping for 30 minutes and it can have thermal damage.
That way the rest of the body is exposed, isn't it?
But it is more focused onto the wound side, sir.
But still, I'm sure it spills over to the sides. Anyway, that's okay. And when you had these cases, you had 3 groups, like heat, cold, and neutral. And you had hernia stomas in all the 3 groups. So did you compare all the hernias with cold, heat, and neutral, made a group of that, and then concluded, because that would have been a little more significant. Like, you know, all the inguinal hernias which we operated, unilateral inguinal hernias, of which 10 had heat therapy, 10 had cold therapy, and 10 were neutral. And again, seeing midline laparotomy wounds for the stomas or whatever, all those things again separate. So that would have been a little more prudent, because when we're talking about pain, obviously, when you're operating for a major procedure and with the midline laparotomy wound, the pain will be a little more than when compared to an inguinal hernia. And you had the 3 groups in all the 3. Probably yes, it's good for thought.
Yes.
But although
yes,
whatever, but but I should say an interesting topic. Well done.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Lakshman, sir.
Yeah, Doc, there are many confounding factors. Now, when you say the pain relief was from your heat or cold, first of all, you must have data on the length of the laparotomy wound. Without that data, there may be a small wound in one and a bigger wound in another. So you cannot attribute your salutary effect to the intervention. Second point that Arun made, but unless you give me data of the temperature at the wound, it would be difficult for me to accept that some light somewhere and a little ice pack sitting somewhere and nothing somewhere had an effect on the wound. We need to know what the temperature at the wound was that was operating. And also, how would you say that you give this intervention for 30 minutes and the effect would last 10 days? At least day 2 and 5 according to you, not much difference in day 10. Are you causing permanent damage to the nerves with 30 minutes of heat or cold? Otherwise, even theoretically, to say that your pain is better on day 2 and 5 after a 30-minute intervention on day, in the immediate post-op phase would be working. The concept, I congratulate you, is good, but I think the methodology would suggest that it needs a lot of improvement before we can attribute the salutary effect, the good effect for the intervention.
No, why this was not done on the day 2 and day 5? The same thing when the patient was in the hospital, it could have been done and probably could have had a more better data. But also done, yeah, it is a pilot study, a good one. But as Dr. Lakshman sir was telling, when the patient was in the hospital, the same thing, because once you do on day 0, if you say it's a long-standing pain relief and this has helped, somewhere kind of, but at the same time, when you do it on day 0, day 2, day 4, day 5, or probably even every day, it's not going to harm the patient. Probably then you will be having more better data.
Sir, we have done only on immediate post-operative, then day 2 and day 5.
Okay.
No, the intervention was just immediate post-op, right? Intervention was not on. Did you have the intervention on day 2 and day 5 also?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Because even I thought it was on day 2 and day 5 also.
Yeah. Okay. But also, please note that again, we need to have the data on analgesic use. You didn't show us any data. How much other analgesia was given? So if you want to, as I said, if you want to attribute all the advantage to the intervention, which is either heat or cold, we need much better data. I mean, I'm not bothered about the sample size. I know that in a pilot in COVID time it should be small, but methodology needs to be improved, please.
Sir, we had given to almost all the patients same analgesics like injection tramadol, and only at 9 p.m.
We need data on your slides.
Okay,
that
sir.
Is important. Data on your slides which says that it was the same thing. And there is a concept of an equi-analgesic dose. There are what are called morphine equivalents. So if you give different analgesia, you need to do that. Was it on demand? Was it on patient's demand, or was it given whether they had pain or not? All this data has to be documented and shown to the audience before you attribute the advantage to your intervention.
Okay, sir.
Dr. Ravi Shankar?
I think Dr. Lakshman has made all the points that I also had to.
Oh.
I think if you had temperature sensors in the wound to show the difference in the temperature, before and after treatment or whatever, and between the other group where there was no intervention, then it would have been a better study.
Yes, sir.
Okay, sir.
Time is up. Thank you.
Yes.
Move on to next
We'll move on
presentation.
to the last paper, Judges to Know, 5th paper. Dr. Abhilash will be presenting for surgery unit 5. Is a post-active surgery, management of chest trauma.
Good evening, sir. Respected President Dr. Venkatachalam, Honorary Secretary Dr. Harisha, respected HOD of Department of Surgery, St. John's Medical College Hospital, and good evening to one and all present in the meeting. I am presenting a study, an observational study of chest trauma and its management and outcome at a tertiary center. Trauma is known to be a major cause of worldwide mortality and morbidity as a result of heavy road traffic incidents and rising crime rates in the society. Out of which thoracic trauma is responsible for nearly 25% of all deaths. And patients with thoracic trauma present in the emergency, most of them are treated asymptomatically, and only about 5 to 10% of patients require major operative interventions. The need for this study is to make an analysis and interpretation of chest injuries, right from the demographic details, how they present in the emergency, and how they are managed in the hospital, and the outcome, to know true proportion and effective management of chest injuries. And the aim is to assess the effectiveness of management and its outcome at a tertiary care center. The study period was between 1st of August 2019 to 1st of August 2021. It was a prospective observational study. An ethical clearance from St. John's Ethical Board was taken, and consent was taken for every patient under the study. A total of 84 patients were recruited from the wards of general surgery, cardiothoracic-vascular surgeries, pulmonary medicine, and surgical ICU. And the bedside evaluations were taken for data and along with medical record review. Data collection included the age of the patients, their gender, time and type of incident, cause and type of trauma, according to their history and case notes, physical examination, lab and radiological investigations, and the type of management they underwent. Inclusion criteria were patients aged above 18 or those who presented to the casualty with chest trauma, and those patients who were not giving consent for the study, and those who suffered cardiac arrest, or those who died prior to any interventions after coming to the hospital were excluded. This is a formula that we use for a statistical analysis to observe morbidity of 22%. With 8% absolute precision and 95% confidence levels. Data was gathered by means of checklists and presented in the form of mean and standard deviations. Analyzed with t-statistics, and p-value less than 0.05 was considered significant. The results of the study, out of the total 84 patients, 69 were males and 15 females. The mean age group among males was 34, and mean age group among females was 55. About 69% had blunt trauma, and 31% had penetrating trauma. This is a graphical representation of the same. Male was 82% and female was 17.8%. 69% had blunt trauma and 23% penetrating trauma. Based on the etiology, they were divided into road traffic accidents, occupational injuries, fall from height, stab injuries, assault, and gunshot injuries. And we have a graphical representation of the same, where we see road traffic accident accounted for a majority of the chest trauma incidents, about 44% road traffic accidents, followed by 22% of occupational injuries, 13% fall from height, assault about 10%, and gunshot of 2.3%. There are 2 cases. And according to the mode of presentation, about 45 patients came with chest pain, and 23 patients associated with breathing difficulty, and 4 patients were brought unconscious, and about 7% were asymptomatic. The graphic showing, this is a graph showing that majority of the patients presented chest pain and breathing difficulty. Based on clinical signs, about 36% were positive for chest compression, and 28% had reduced breath sounds. Coming to diagnosis, the investigations that helped in diagnosing these trauma cases, chest X-ray contributed chest X-ray contributed to about 46%. Chest X-ray contributed to about 46%, while CT was done for 20. CT was useful in about 21% of cases. Ultrasound in about 13, echocardiography about 10%, and bronchoscopy with CT angiography was done in about 2 to 3% cases where the source of bleed was difficult to find. There were also associated bony fractures along with chest trauma, the highest being rib fractures, about 51%, followed by 15% patients who had clavicle fracture. The least was patients, one patient who had a sternal fracture as well. And 25% of patients did not have any associated bony fractures. This is a graph representing the same. Coming to intrathoracic pathologies, about 36% of people presented with pneumothorax, out of which 11 patients had open wounds and the other 20 had closed wounds with underlying pneumothorax. Hemothorax and hemopneumothorax contribute about 23.8%, and flail chest was seen about 19% of patients. A very minimal number of patients presented with also aortic rupture, diaphragmatic tears, esophageal injuries, and tracheobronchial tree injuries. Concomitant injuries, most of them associated injuries were of head, neck, and facial-maxillary, about 23%, followed by abdominal, spinal, and long bone injuries, about 9%, and least was pelvis, pelvic fractures, which were 4%. Coming to management of the patients, the interventions they underwent, about 46% of patients underwent conservative management. They weren't in need for any surgical interventions or invasive interventions. They were managed clean with chest physiotherapy, pain management, and in case of infections, IV antibiotics. ICD insertion was put for about 36% of patients, and about 13% needed just wound suturing. Only about 5% needed major surgical interventions, and the surgical interventions that they underwent were lobectomies, primary esophageal repairs, diaphragmatic repairs, and total deaths were about 7. This is a picture of a lobectomy done on the 31-year-old blunt trauma patient, male patient. Coming to discussion, chest injury is one of the most leading causes of mortality and morbidity in general, and more so in an urban population. In our study, predominantly, males were seen to be more affected with chest injury, especially blunt trauma, since they are more involved in public activities and vehicle driving, and more so seen in the 3rd decade of life in males, and females it was seen at the 5th decade. Although here RTA and self-fall was being mostly contributed. And incidents of blunt trauma were more than penetrating traumas. As with other studies, the study also showed that RTA was the most common mode of injury, especially among the young males. And the next common mode was occupational injuries, followed by fall from height and assault. Most common presenting features of these patients were chest pain and breathing difficulty. And this is suggestive that patients should be given primary importance in evaluation, even if there is no external injury. This is to rule out intrathoracic injuries and thereby reducing the mortality. And a small percentage of patients who presented with unconsciousness with low GCS also needed multidisciplinary interventions such as neurosurgery, because many presented with cerebral injuries. And about 7% were asymptomatic, as they had no underlying injuries and were managed with minimal treatment. Clinically, on clinical assessment, most common was chest compression. And those who had these signs also had complaints of breathing difficulty, which are much more serious. And for this life-saving procedure was ICD insertion, bedside, which was minimal and did not need any extensive investigation or equipments for management. Coming to rib fractures, they were the next most common injuries, among which 11 patients had flail chest. and while the others were also associated with other bone fractures. In patients who had chest injuries with flail chest, pain control was the most important factor to have been considered. And with appropriate pain control, which was achieved by opioid analgesics infusion and oral analgesics, patients improved very well. And coupled with respiratory physiotherapy, which was performed in all patients who had chest injury with hip fracture, it proved to be very efficient in recovery and outcome of the patient.
You can conclude.
Yes, sir. The remaining 5% needed major surgical interventions. And mortality rate in this study was 7.1% and morbidity rate was 11.5%. Similar studies, in a study titled Profile of Chest Injuries in Tertiary Center, a study done on 57 patients. The age range was 3 to 78 years. Most affected were males, and blunt injury was 82%, while road traffic accident was responsible for 70%. And the study concluded that most patients survived, requiring general resuscitation or simple tube insertion with few complications. Similarly, another study by Alexander and John, where 199 patients included, showed majority of males, while females were just 22%. And most common age group was 30. Yes, sir. The conclusion is early presentation to the emergency with minimal interventions like ICD drainage, pain management, physiotherapy is sufficient to manage chest trauma in a tertiary care center and with a good effective outcome. While a few will, however, need major surgical interventions in case of major thoracic injuries.
Thank you, Dr. Abhilash.
Yes,
Paper open for discussion. Dr. Arun, Dr. Harindranath.
Dr. Abhilash.
Yes, sir.
What is innovative or what is the take-home message from your paper?
Take-home message is chest trauma can be dealt with minimal measures, early resuscitation, and important life-saving techniques like ICD insertion, pain management, and physiotherapy. It's very useful in
2 minutes,
its outcome. Sir? Yes, sir?
No, continue.
Yes, sir. So these measures are very useful in bringing the outcome of a chest trauma patient at a tertiary center.
These are all the standard treatment protocols. Anything different or anything new?
It's almost in line with the other studies, sir. It's just a thing studying in our institute. Okay. It's an observational study.
I have no more questions.
Any more questions from the audience? Dr. Harindranath? To the judges, that was the last paper. With the permission of chair, I would like to present our poster which was missed out.
Please proceed, sir. Please proceed with the poster left out for.
Yeah. This will be presented by Dr. Shreyas Bellur, who is junior resident in cardiothoracic surgery. Its topic is unusual case of a non-resolving hydropneumothorax. Dr. Shreyas, you can present.
Yes, just 1 minute. I'm just.
Yeah.
3 minutes. 2 minutes.
Yes, sir. I would like to take an opportunity to thank respected President Dr. Venkatachala, Honorable Secretary Dr. Harisha, and my HOD Dr. Shrikar to allow me an opportunity to present an extremely rare case. Without further ado, I would like to carry on and present a case of an unusual non-resolving hydropneumothorax. A hydropneumothorax is a collection of air and fluid in thorax, and etiologies commonly include trauma, infection, and in our case, a malignancy to an extremely rare one, a primary mediastinal synovial cell sarcoma. The tumors, the cells of origin are relatively unknown, but it's attributed to arise from the mesothelium. And the incidence is about 1 in 10,000 cases, of which arise from the mediastinum. We presented a 22-year-old female with no known comorbidities who came with complaints of a 2-month history of productive cough, persistent fever. Sputum was characteristically gray in color with mucoid consistency. No hemoptysis, no loss of weight, or history of tuberculosis were reported. Cardiac involvement was potentially ruled out as no prevalent cardiac symptoms were present. The patient also underwent multiple thoracocentesis outside, but unfortunately, fluid analysis reports were unavailable. Examination, positive signs on examination yielded a reduced air entry on the right side with a subcussion splash. Pre-op lab investigations were normal except for low hemoglobin. Alpha-fetoprotein and beta-HCG, which are routine germ cell tumor markers we send for chest masses, were normal as well. Preoperative chest X-ray showed a loculated effusion with an air fluid level suggestive of a right hydropneumothorax, and a CT chest showed a well-defined cystic lesion in the right hemothorax, measuring 13 to 11 centimeters in size, with approximately 500 milliliters of fluid within, with multiple septations and air foci seen, with no obvious connection to the airway. The cyst was big enough to cause a mediastinal shift to the left, with compression collapse of the underlying lung. Preoperatively, the differential was, in our mind, loculated empyema or a ruptured infected hydatid cyst, given the history and presence of fever. And we planned to do a right expiratory thoracotomy. We went via a right thoracotomy approach and we executed a right dual excision. And intra-op, we found that the cyst was thick-walled, arose from the mediastinal pleura. And when we cut open the cyst, there were solid areas present, and fluid evacuated was about 350 ml. And adhesions to the lung and diaphragm were present, and it was densely adhered. Postoperative stages, histopatch showed a solid cystic lesion with hypercellular areas composed of interlacing spindle cells, which was suggestive of the monophasic variant of this cancer. And IHC was corroborative, and a Ki-67 index of 70 to 80% was reported, given indicating its high malignant status. Fluid cytology, unfortunately, did not give us much information, as it was a paucicellular cyst fluid with few lymphocytes. Postoperative follow-up, we did a PET CT on postoperative 20, which showed no evidence of residual disease or metastasis. These tumors are extremely rare and aggressive. They're wrongly named as cells of origin elude the literature. But it's conclusively proven that they do not resemble synovial cells, but rather resemble highly aggressive, poorly differentiated round cells that arise from the mesothelium. Aptly known as a translocation-associated tumor, as a translocation between the X and the 18th chromosome gave rise to a fusion transcription factor, which was attributed to play a role in malignancy. However, in very, very few cases, no such discernible chromosomal abnormality was found. Given the size, given the insidious onset of the disease, the presentations vary from productive cough to hemoptysis and are often misleading. Cyst mimics cavity disease, TB, bronchogenic cysts, hydatid cysts, and even when you consider malignancies, adenocarcinoma should be first on your mind when you get a differential. Genetic studies do clinch the diagnosis. However, in a country like ours, imaging adjuncts such as imaging histopatch should be used. Complete surgical resection is a treatment of choice, provided metastasis is ruled out, in which case palliation is a better choice of treatment. In conclusion, primary mediastinal synovial tumors are highly aggressive tumors with dire metastatic potential. Imaging histopath are keys to diagnosis. Complete resection with chemoradiation are goals when metastases are present. Palliation is the goal when metastases are absent. Palliation is the goal when metastasis is present. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shreyas.
Thank you, Doctor. So we come to the end of the presentation. So I thank Dr. Subramania SG, Professor and HOD of St. John's Medical College for this better coordination and presenting a wonderful academic session in this evening. I congratulate all the postgraduates of St. John's Medical College for their innovative papers, both posters and papers. They're so good and very innovative. So I thank all the participants and members of Surgical Society Bangalore. So I have some announcement to make from the Surgical Society Bangalore.
Dr. Harish,
sir.
shall I thank?
Yeah, please, sir. Please,
yeah.
Sir.
I would like to thank Surgical Society Bangalore, especially Dr. Venkatachala and Dr. Harisha for their support, and other EC members also for giving us the opportunity to share our scientific material. I also thank all members of the Surgical Society who have participated today. I would like to thank staff of faculty of Department of Surgery, especially head of the units, assistant professors, SRs and PGs who have worked so hard for past 8-10 days in order to come out with this kind of material. I would like to thank my super specialty HODs and their staff for their support and participation in this meeting today. And I would like to thank Dr. Glenn and Kumar for their support and planning, which was very good. And I'm happy to announce that we have transferred 25,000 to the Surgical Society account by NEFT. Thank you again.
Thank you for your gesture, sir. So I thank the today's judges, Dr. Arindranath and Dr.
Yeah. Sorry,
Arun Kumar.
Go on.
Yes, sir. Please, sir.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, but I forgot to mention judges.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Dr. Arun, Dr. Harindranath, and Dr. Srikantaya for your judging the session today.
Thank you, sir. So, Surgical Society Bangalore offer Millennium Gold Medal Award for this year 2021. The circular has been sent to the emails. So I request all the members who are eligible to go through the application form and please apply for that. And we offer a traveling fellowship in laparoscopic surgery. That circular also has been sent. So please, those who are interested, go through the circular and you can apply. So details has been published in the website. And our future program, that is virtual Professor B. Anumaya Memorial National CSEP, we are planning to conduct from 21st to 26th November 2021. I request all the postgraduates participate and register. So we are in a process to start a registration for the same. So I encourage all the postgraduates to register. It will be a wonderful online program. So the results of the today's clinical presentation. The quiz winner, the quiz organized by St. John's Medical College is started by Dr. Mayank, DNB postgraduate from St. Martha's Medical College. I congratulate Dr. Mayank. The best poster is our experience of surgeries in COVID-19 patients by Dr. Ajay Francis. So the two best papers, Predictors of Difficulty in Laparoscopic Cholecystectomy by Dr. Joe Thomas, that goes to the second. And the first paper, the best paper is Effect of Postoperative Local Change in Temperature on Postoperative Pain and Surgical Site Infection, a prospective study by Dr. Simley. Congratulate both the presenters.
I congratulate all the people who were awarded prizes today. But everyone has done well and everyone has put the efforts. But
I request Dr. Lakshman sir, just play the national anthem.
All right, if I can share, yeah, I'll do that in a second. Give me a minute, please. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Venkatachala sir, anything to say?
Nothing, Harish. It was very good. No, topics were good. And except for some technical glitches, everything went on fine and very well coordinated, and you completed on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
I'm a co-host, right? But I'm wondering whether I'll get the sound or not, because it is not allowing me to.
Well, I'll try it, sir. Meanwhile, I will
do it. Yeah, because it is not allowing me to share the sound.
Am I sharing, sir, right now?
You will know. I mean, you're not sharing the screen, but if you look, I think it allows only the host. So if you go,
Yes.
or you can make me the host if you want, one of the two. But you try it yourself.
Yes.
At the top end, it allows you have to share the sound of the computer. Otherwise, it'll only the
Yes,
image.
sir. Right now I'm playing, sir. Just enough. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, we are not hearing the sound. That is the problem. You have to enable the sound. You're muted, so take away that mute.
Unmuted, but that I'm trying. That also I'm not able to do.
Yeah, it's okay now.
Is it audible, sir?
Yeah. Not clearly. Not clearly. Okay, shall I try it again?
Yes, please.
Let me just try it.
Try from mobile and unmute yourself.
No,
Play from the
I'm all set now. It's allowing me to do it now.
Okay. Right.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मागे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
Okay, good night.
Good night. Thank you.